Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Keval Hari, and I am the Executive Director of the Gala Queer Archives. And it really is some of that history, because I think one, as an archive, history is important to us, but I think it really speaks to, or at least sets an important tone for this book discussion. Mark Gevisser, as many of you know, is a prominent South African author, political journalist, and filmmaker who has done significant work in print, film, and exhibitions in excavating queer South African history. Much of this has been in collaboration with Gala. Gevisser co-edited, along with Edwin Cameron, the seminal work Defiant Desire, Gay and Lesbian Lives in South Africa in 1994, a book that is long out of print but still frequently used and critiqued by researchers to the archive as an introductory text. In 1998, Gevisser initiated, wrote, and produced the documentary The Man Who Drove with Mandela, about the life of Cecil Williams, a well-known theatre director in South Africa in the 1950s. As background for that film, Gevisser also initiated the Oral History Project with Gala. And for the project, many older gays and lesbians were interviewed about their lives in the 1950s and 60s in South Africa. And many of the interviewees donated or lent for copying their photographs and other memorabilia. And this collection is still frequently requested at Gala. In 1999, Gevisser joined up with Gala again for the film Josie the Queer Tour, which was based on the queer tour initiated by Gala in 1999 for the ILGA conference, which was held in Johannesburg. And funny enough, this year we were meant to rebirth the Josie Queer Tour in partnership with Lalanje, which is based at Ponte Towers, and obviously coronavirus had other plans for it. But we plan to relaunch the tour next year with great gusto. And so, you know, it's really great to see that continuation. Gevisser also collaborated with Gala on 2 exhibitions in 2008, the Home Affairs at Apartheid Museum and Joburg Trek's Sexuality in the City at Constitution Hill and Museum Africa. Again, both these exhibitions and their resulting background material made a significant impact in the archive. And so we take great pride in celebrating the publication of the Pink Line, Mark, particularly as you will always be considered a part of the Gala family. And now on to the brilliant Letlhogonolo Mokgoroane of Cheeky Natives. As many of you may or may not know, the Cheeky Natives is a literary podcast primarily focused on the review, curatorship, and archiving of Black literature. And given that I'm a little partial to cheekiness myself, I've always really appreciated and enjoyed the visibility that Cheeky Natives provides, particularly for a kind of Black platform for literature and reading, which I think is so absolutely important, particularly within the kind of queer spaces that the archive exists within. Letlhogonolo obtained his LLB from Stellenbosch University, and after university served articles and later became an associate at Bowman Gilfillan. He also served as a law clerk for Justice Madlanga at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. His areas of interest include queer theory, intersectionality, and dismantling oppressive systems, which is why he's the ideal person to be having this conversation with you, Mark. He also obtained the Sonke UCLA Human Rights and Fellowship in 2017-2018 and completed his master's in law, specializing in public interest law and policy and critical race studies. He was named one of the top 200 young South Africans in 2018, and I would say that that title carries well into 2019 and 2020. And he's currently doing his pupillage, so we wish you really well with your future as an advocate. So before I hand over, just a few house rules. As you know, we're discussing the Pink Line and look very forward to that discussion. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this, but also please do make sure that you get your books, your copy of the Pink Line, particularly from Love Books. It's particularly important for us at this stage to be supporting local business. And if you want to grab a copy, I would suggest that you go to lovebooks.co.za, or you can visit the store in Melville. And then just to kind of start the conversation, you know, I've been thinking a lot about the Pink Line, and I've, you know, read a lot of some of the publications and reviews that were written about it. And I want to thank you all for taking this time to be present with us. We know that we're in a time of great heartache and uncertainty and alienation. And so I'm really grateful for us to have this opportunity to create a sense of community, and also aware of the privilege that comes where the sense of community is not necessarily accessible to many of us who have either been forced back into the closet in our homes during lockdown or who don't have the means and access to do this. And I wanted to also take a moment to express solidarity with the people of Zimbabwe and the people of Beirut, for whom the pink line is not merely a metaphor, but is really an existing line which they continue to walk upon as a form of resistance and resilience in showing love and just the tenacity, which I know that this book kind of speaks of in so many ways. And by sharing that moment of solidarity, I hope that this is also a call to all of us to collectively do whatever is in our power and ability to support our community during this time in whatever way possible. And so with that, I will hand over to Letlhogonolo. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you so much, Keval. That was like a fantastic introduction. Now I have to try and own up to this. Welcome, everyone. What we normally, this is just going to be a book conversation, and I think Keval really set out what we are going to be talking about, but also to think about the moment that we're in, right? Like, we've got this global pandemic that is happening in this moment. And we also are, there are a number of things that are happening. We've got the Zimbabwean Lives Matter. We've got what happened in Beirut. So we're also still continue thinking about Black Lives Matter in the US. It hasn't ended, right? Black Lives Matter, the brutality of police in this country, the brutality towards migrants in this country, it hasn't ended. So I think, to sort of think about a lot of that as we're having this conversation. And, we have the wonderful privilege of being in conversation with Mark today, who's released this book. It's called The Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. And as you can see, it's, nice and thick, So if you want some companionship throughout this lockdown period, perhaps get yourself a copy of The Pink Line. I suppose, Mark, the first question that I have is, the title of the book is The Pink Line. And I know that for someone who hasn't read the book and they look at it at a bookstore, right? What is the Pink Line? What is the Pink Line?
Thank you, Letlhogonolo, and thank you so much, Keval, for your really beautiful introduction. I'm thrilled to be hosted by Gala and Love Books today, two institutions I hold dearly from my hometown, Johannesburg. Always been and broadcast to you today from the where I currently work. The notion of the Pink Line came to me about a decade ago when I was trying to find a way to capture the consequences of a new global conversation around sexual orientation and gender identity that I believe has come to describe, define, and divide the world in entirely new ways. And what was striking to me was the way a human rights front, a new human rights front, is being staked, with being defended and contended around the rights of LGBTQ people. And the actual concept of Pink Line came to me when I looked at my timeline and I saw that in 2013, really within a few weeks of Britain.
Mark, I think there might be something, some people are saying they're struggling to hear you, so I don't know what that might be.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, that's much better.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. The notion of the Pink Line came to me when I looked at the way that just weeks after Britain promulgated the same-sex marriage, Nigeria promulgated an anti-same-sex marriage. even though no one in Nigeria was even asking for same-sex marriage. The most that people were asking for in Nigeria was a right to dignity and to security. What was going on was this was becoming a sort of geopolitical culture wars in which some people in the world were claiming that LGBT rights were a sign of Western colonial secular depredation. And other people in the world were claiming that LGBT rights is what separated them as civilized Europeans from the barbaric other. Somewhere in the middle of this new geopolitical battle were queer people themselves, living on the pink line, trying to live their lives in a world that was changing so dramatically. As I thought more about the pink line in Letlhogonolo, I came to see that it didn't only divide countries from each other, but it ran through countries. And I think we can talk very productively about the way that the pink line runs through South Africa. I saw the way it also divided people, families, communities. If I had a smartphone and a little bit of privacy and some data, I can download globalized ideas about my rights, about my freedom. I can have the kind of community and solidarity and solace that you were talking about just now with reference to us all isolated in the lockdown and communicating here online. But what happens when I look up from my smartphone? What happens when I look up from my smartphone to a stern parent who is policing my gender, to a church which says that I'm demonized, to a state which says I'm illegal? There's a pink line that runs as well through a notion of globalized digital freedom and the strictures and exigencies of offline life. So through the course of this book, I developed the concept of the pink line and look at how it runs through different countries, through different life experiences. In the case of the United States and transgender rights, through children's bathrooms. And now that there's a raging battle over whether transgender children have the right to use the bathrooms congruent with their gender identities. So that's the broad scale of it.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think also the pink line does a lot of ideological moves in the book, and we'll go to talk a bit about that. But I wanted to know if the pink line was a play on, often what we talk about when we talk about queer people, we talk about pink money, right? Pink tourism. And I wanted to know if the pink line in the way that you conceptualize it was also trying to write back to the idea of the pink rand, right? Or the pink dollar or pink tourism.
Well, of course. I mean, I didn't call the book the blue line or the black line. and absolutely, I'm using a color that's associated with LGBTQ rights, both positively and negatively. It's used in a very proactive and positive way by people on one side of the pink line, and it's used in a very negative way by people on the other side. So yes, absolutely. You'll be interested to know, Letlhogonolo, a little bit perturbed when I went onto Instagram. I don't usually go onto Instagram. And I saw that the other use of the pink line is by a company that does black hair products. So if you search the pink line on Instagram, you'll see a few little things about me and a lot of girls with very extensive weaves. Some of which are pink.
I suppose then the other question for me is, tell us about the journey, right, of embarking on this project, because it's a project that spans over countries, but over 6 years. So tell us about when it came to you for you to begin this process.
Well, it's been something that's on my mind. It's been something I've worked on, as Keval said, ever since I worked with Edwin Cameron on Defiant Desire, which, by the way, Keval, is in print, amazingly. Not in South Africa, unfortunately, but it's still carried by Routledge. And it was really through that project, when I was a young man, I was in my mid-20s, that I was challenged in my own sense of the diversity of experience of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that came from being a South African and living in our country, in our diverse country, and trying to get a handle on what queerness, even though we didn't use that word then, we used gay and lesbian then, and we can talk a little bit about how identities have changed over the last decades, what that meant for different people who shared a citizenship with me. And it's had me very curious ever since. It began in some ways with an extraordinary archive that's in Gala of two older gay men from Soweto who lived what might be damned in gay liberation ideology as a double life, because they had their wives and their children, but they were lovers on the down low. And they would sneak off to a migrant labor hostel, which is same-sex only, to be with each other on weekends. And from our perspective, from a Western liberated queer perspective, we see them as being in the closet. We see them as leading a double life. We think about how they weren't fulfilled. We also think about how their wives must have been shortchanged. And while all of that might be true, they were living the best way that they could within the strictures of their communities and cultures. And I wanted to understand, I guess from that starting point, from Johannesburg, from Soweto, from my experience as a queer Johannesburger in our diverse society, I wanted to understand that on a global scale. I wanted to understand what happens when these globalized ideas of universal human rights, of biomedical gender transition, what happens when they come into contact with cultures, with realities, with experiences, where there have been other ways of dealing with gender non-conformity or with same-sex desire. How do queer people all over the world balance tradition and modernity? What does it look like? And most of all, what do they do rather than what is done unto them? And I think that's been an absolutely critical part of the journey for me, is understanding the agency of the people I meet and I write about, and trying to capture not just how the world changes them, but how they change the world.
And I suppose then to, pick up from one of the protagonists in the book, Liam, who made a decision to, sort of be like, I want to be able to tell my own story. I wanted us to spend a little bit of time speaking about positionality, right? I think that, we've been having a lot of conversations, particularly in the literature space, about who gets to tell our stories, right? Like who is the right face, the right person to tell the story. And I wanted to speak about that because I think that there could be a lot of pushback against you, Mark, as a cis gay white man of middle-class background in South Africa, writing this book about predominantly, let's use the American term of people of color. And I wanted to speak about that, like how you can, whether that was a consideration in writing the book. I know that you mentioned that, as Kwame says, I position myself, this is my standing. I won't continuously reproduce this idea of saying I'm white, I'm a white cis gay man. But I wanted to speak about positionality. How did you come to terms with the fact that you are this white person writing this book?
Sure. I mean, I'm grateful for the question. It's something I'm very self-conscious of, and that I really try and deal with in the book. So what happened with Liam, what Letlhogonolo was referring to was Liam was a transgender kid that I met when he was 17. And he was struggling because he had parents who disagreed over whether he should medically transition. And I met him when he was still a minor, and he was really happy to meet me. We had a wonderful time. I met his parents. He then turned 18. He transitioned. He went on to become a very significant and powerful activist in his own right. He's a person of color too. He's Asian. And he made a decision that he no longer wanted me to tell his story. He wanted to tell his own story. And what could I do but respect that? I mean, more power to him. How brilliant. We agreed that I could still write about him, but only up until the time where he had made this decision, and he agreed with that. He agreed with me about that absolutely wholeheartedly. It really brings home precisely the difficulties that Letlhogonolo is talking about. Now, there are many ways of coming at it. The one way of coming at it is how I come at it as a journalist and as a humanist, which is that I really believe, and I teach this as well because I teach journalism, that there are many things you can learn, but there are three things you have to have if you want to do this work: perseverance, curiosity, and empathy. And empathy means putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. I think it's the foundation of the work of a reporter or a journalist to do that. It's also, I think, a foundational premise of humanism, is to try and understand the paths that other people walk. How do you do that in such a way that respects their agency, so that you're not appropriating their story, so that you're not taking their story and using it for your own good and sort of trampling on them, which is where these questions arise. So one of the ways I try and do that in my book is by being conscious of who I am when I enter these spaces. For example, I tell the story of a young Ugandan man named Michael Bashaija. And I met Michael when he was 17 as well. And a terrible thing had just happened to him. I met him in Kampala. He had been forced to leave home. He'd been chucked out of his home. His family chucked him out of his home by just deciding to stopping to feed him. And he arrived in Kampala, destitute. He somehow got his hands on a smartphone. Somebody told him about Facebook. He used Facebook to connect with people. Some of whom took him in and were really helpful to him. But somebody catfished him on Facebook, which means that they lured him into an assignation. They tortured him. They sexually abused him. They extorted him. He managed to escape, and he was brave enough to lay charges against that person. And I met him just after he'd been to court, and very bravely looked his attacker in the eye. And here was a young man who, and my heart went out to him. How could it not? Particularly having remembered myself being a gay teenager with a supportive family and with no material hardship, how difficult it was for me. I had to think about what's it like for him. And what happened is that I became involved in an initiative to help send him to school, which is that I contributed some money, it wasn't very much money, towards him going to school. Immediately, that created a particular relationship between the two of us, with me as something of a patron. It wasn't anticipated by me. I'd acted from my heart, but that's what happened. And what I try and do in the book is I sort of try and leave myself and look at that relationship and how that relationship was created, and how, if I'm going to talk about how LGBT rights is carried by the vectors of globalization, by the digital revolution, by commodity culture, as it transmits this idea of gay from Amsterdam or from New York, I have to understand myself as one of those vectors of globalization. I came to Kampala with my computer in my backpack and my ideas on my computer and my wallet in my pocket. And that wallet has power whether I want it to or not. And it's about, I think, Letlhogonolo, trying to be two things. Firstly, acknowledging the agency of the people you write about. Three things: acknowledging the agency of the people you write about. Secondly, working with them in a collaborative way so that nothing you write is against their will or without their permission. And thirdly, being aware of who you are in the world, which is, I think, not just a political act, but an act of good writing. Because if I want you to accept me as your guide through these troubled waters, you have to know who I am as a guide. I can't pretend to be God with a God's eye view, somewhat objective. I am subjective. I am me. I move into these spaces in my white, middle-aged, cisgendered body.
And I think you bring up such interesting questions that I wanted to, just spend a bit of time on. I think often about Liam and about the idea that Liam was able to, take the agency and say, I want to be the author of my story. And then there been this collaboration between you and Liam about the idea of, here is what I've written. And I wonder about some of the other protagonists in the book whose language may not be first language, for instance, English as a first language. How was that process? Like, did they have sort of the same courtesy that Liam had in terms of, you know, reading what was written about them and saying, I'm okay with this going out into the world? I'm really interested in the agency that was afforded to the other protagonists who weren't English native speakers.
I worked with a formidable team of interpreters because I worked in many languages that I don't speak, from Tamil to Russian. And I worked in some languages which I speak very badly, like Spanish. And I did my very best with my interpreters to make sure that even if the people I was writing about didn't have a verbatim translation of what I was writing, that they understood it as much as possible, and that they had the right to really to veto, to influence, to say what they wanted in, what they wanted out, how they wanted it. I did my best. Again, this is something that I feel is a tenet of journalism, and that I teach as well. It's like, frankly, I did not give Thabo Mbeki that permission, because, you know, he's a media savvy man in power, and if he's sitting face to face with a journalist, like, he's fair game. So I did not take such care with Thabo Mbeki, even though I'm a white man and he's a black man, because I saw him as somebody very empowered in our relationship. Because the people I was working with here are not necessarily media savvy, because they don't have online or global profiles, it was more important to me, it was essential to me to try and do that work to the best of my ability.
And I wonder then also about the idea of this white saviorism that comes, you know, when we think about like how oftentimes white people come with, as you said, with their wallets and their money. And I wondered about like, what are some of the things that you thought about? So I suppose the question is twofold, right? What do you make of people who may think of you writing this book as trying to be a white savior of these queer people? And also, how do you approach race just generally in the work that you do?
You know, one of the answers is again with self-consciousness. So in fact, there's a passage in the book where another person I write about is an extraordinary transgender woman named Tiwonge Chimbalanga, who is an exile from Malawi and who lives in Cape Town. And again, because I felt it was my duty, I became involved in helping her get employment. And in helping her get employment, well, let me not say in helping her get employment, as a consequence of her employment, I noted that she was becoming more stable after a very rocky start in South Africa. And I write about how I went to hear her give a talk at a fundraiser for LGBTQ refugees at a place called The Nest in Cape Town. And she was magnificent. And I kind of, my heart beat with pride. And I had to ask myself, and I asked myself in the book, was that a kind of, despite my best intentions, was that a kind of glimmer of a sort of white savior complex that was kind of beating through my politically correct armor? I believe we all have to be open, particularly if we write or talk from a position of privilege. We have to be open to the ways that we are racist, that we are classist, that we are sexist, that we are gender normative. And I really hold to that in my own work. I mean, the other thing I guess I can say about this is that, and this has to do with the way I end the book, and the way I reflect on the ending of the book, is that I think there are two ways for somebody of privilege to kind of enter spaces less privileged. One way is to enter with a kind of a sense that you have the answers, that you're bringing the light, that you know that your Western way of gay, of being out and proud of whatever, is the way. Another way is to go in with as much humility as you can and to say, what can I learn from this situation? How do I grow from this situation? And very quickly, I'll tell the story that I tell at the very end of my book, which is that in India, I interviewed a group of people who are class-wise as far away from me as anybody who I interviewed. Some really poor, marginal, queer fisherfolk in a village in the south of India who call themselves kotis. And koti means woman's heart in a man's body. And I have nothing in common with these people, not even a single word of Tamil that we can share, or a single word of English, because when I first met them in 2012, they didn't speak any English. And in the way of the culture with the interpreter, as we went around introducing ourselves, we had to say our names and our pronouns and our gender identity. And when it came to me, I said Mark, he, him, his. And before I knew it, the word koti had come out of my mouth. And I've had to ask myself, and I asked myself in the book, why did I do that? Was it because I was trying to sort of manufacture some kind of empathy with these people, say that I'm like them, even though, you know, in so many ways I'm not? I'm one of you, you can trust me. Was it a kind of ruse or a device? I don't think it was. I mean, I think that it was a way of saying we have something in common, but I also think I felt good about saying koti because I'd learned something about fluid gender identity from them. I'd learned something about fluid gender identity from them that I'm able to apply back to myself and to think a little bit differently about myself and my own gender identity. I'm still a man. I'm still cisgender. I still use the pronouns he, him, his. But something got destabilized in me by hanging out with these kotis. And that's how I grow, and that's how I bring you this book.
But I wonder then, Mark, when I think I read that section and I sat with it for a bit because I was wondering about notions of cultural appropriation. Yes, it could be true that as you say, you felt connected with these people, but living in the world that we live in and thinking about the positionality that you hold, what about the place of like culturally appropriating something that may be so sacred to these people who are from India, from this community? And I wanted to know, what are your thoughts about, or what was your resolve around it not being or being cultural appropriation?
It had to do, as I've said already, Letlhogonolo, very intensely with some form of collaboration. Within the limits that we've said. I don't speak a word of Tamil, but it had to do with, from the very beginning, making sure that they understood who I was, why I was there, what I planned to do. It had to do with my interpreter reading back my draft in real time to some of them so that they could hear it in Tamil and comment, which they did. They're very empowered people. They said I had some things wrong. They asked me to correct it. It has to do now with the pleasure that I'm seeing Lakshya, who's the main koti who I write about, take in forwarding to people in her network the work that I've done, because she understands it as an affirmation of herself. Yeah, I mean, sure, it's in a book with my name. They're my sentences. I get the royalties, but I am sharing the royalties in I must say a small way, but hopefully a significant way, with everybody who participated in the book. If they need it, if they don't need it, they're welcome to give their share to a charity or philanthropy of their choice.
Thank you. I wanted to speak about a bit about the moves that you make in the book, which I think are quite good because you do some analytical work and then you have intercepted with these people's stories, right? And I think what is useful about the book is to to dispel the notion of homosexuality being an African, right? And I want to talk a bit about the Russian part of the book, right, where you speak about like, the culture wars that happen in Europe, because oftentimes we think about the West as this utopian of human rights, right? But the book really shows us that the West is not as progressive as we think it is. So I want to talk a bit about like the idea of you thinking about Russia and the fight for queer rights in Russia and what that has informed about like the idea of the West being the importer of homosexuality to Africa.
Well, I mean, the Russians and the homophobic Russians or homophobic and transphobic Russians kind of feel quite similarly to homophobic and transphobic Africans, which is that they see the notion of LGBTQ rights, they see gay identity, they see transgenderism as a Western depredation, as a secular Western threat to their traditional Russian society. In their instance, they are trying to draw a line against Western Europe and against the European Union. And Vladimir Putin really drove this because he's trying to establish a sort of alternative European center of power to the West. So he wants to say, and also in Eastern Europe, you must remember there was this, there were these decades of communism, which were very difficult. So what leaders like Vladimir Putin or Viktor Orban of Hungary or Andrzej Duda, who is the newly re-elected president of Poland, what they want to say is they want to say that this LGBT ideology is just like communism. In fact, the Archbishop of Krakow, the Catholic Archbishop of Krakow said, it used to be a red peril and now it's a rainbow peril. And just as communists tried to bring these unnatural, inhuman ideas and socially engineer our society, so too do Brussels and George Soros, does the West, does America want to bring these unnatural ideas that men can be women and women can be men and two men can marry each other to our society. So there's a kind of a similar pink line dynamic generically between what's happening between Eastern Western Europe and what happens between some African countries and Europe or the West. I mean, what's interesting to me, once more, as I said in the beginning, is the way that queer Russians or queer Africans position themselves within that. If you are Russian and you are queer, and you have been Russian since you were born, and you've been queer since the moment you were able to conceptualize that, but you're told that being Russian, you cannot be queer in Russian, because queerness is something from outside. And if you are gay or if you are transgender, it means you've been invaded by the West. What does that do to your own subjectivity? How do you find yourself? How do you fight your corner? How do you live as a Russian or a Nigerian? And it's been fascinating and really illuminating for me to see how people do, how they claim themselves and their histories as Russians or as Nigerians or as Ugandans or as Malawians. The reason why Tiwonga Chimbalanga had to come into exile to South Africa was because she held a traditional Malawian engagement ceremony called a Chinkoswe, when she wanted to engage her fiance. And it was for this reason that she was arrested and thrown into jail. She was claiming her Malawiness and her queerness at the same time. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I think it does, and I think it brings up more interesting questions. But before we continue with the questions, I just want to give people who are watching a taste of like what the pink line is about. So I'd just like you to read from the prologue, just so that people have a feeling, for the words.
Sure. So, I mean, the section that Letlhogonolo has asked me to read is in a way about my own positionality, because it's in the prologue, and it's talking a little bit about how I came to do this work. And I should say before I read it that Tewonge Chimbalanga is known universally as Auntie. So when I say Auntie, I'm talking about her. This book is Auntie's story, and that of others from different parts of the world who have found themselves on what I've come to call the pink line, a human frontier that divided and described the world in an entirely new way in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. No global movement has caught fire as quickly as the one that came to be known as LGBT. The worlds Auntie and I inhabited in 2014, when I first met her, are unimaginably different from how they had been for each of us, from such different places, even a decade previously. Auntie's home in Tambo village is not 20 kilometers from the handsome century-old bungalow overlooking the ocean where I wrote this book. My husband, C, and I bought it in 2012. We were married 3 years earlier in 2009, the same year that Auntie held her Chinkoswe. But while her commitment ceremony brought her abject humiliation, a 14-year jail sentence, and a life in unwanted exile, mine got me a much-desired few years in Paris, spousal benefits from C's job, and the same rights as any other married couple in our home country, South Africa. Our post-apartheid constitution was famously the first in the world to guarantee equality on the basis of sexual orientation. 10 years later, South Africa became the 5th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. Here we were, a married gay couple, the beneficiaries of rights in a way I could not have imagined when I was a young man. 3 decades previously, a steely defiance cloaking my terror, I'd come out to my own parents at the age of 19. They were supportive, but my father couldn't hide his concern. Would I ever know the joys of family? Would I lead a lonely life? I had fought my corner. Of course I could have children. Of course I would find love. But it was 1983. There was not yet even an internet to provide me with the ammunition of information and the solace of a virtual community, and I struggled to convince myself. Then, as I was opening into adulthood, the AIDS epidemic descended, with its cruel confirmation of everything gay men had been taught to believe about ourselves. We were sinners, and we were being punished. Our sexuality was morbid, and we would die. Through all of this, I came to believe fervently that I and others like me had the same right to live openly as anyone else, and I did my bit to fight for this. As an undergraduate in the US in the 1980s, I took on the mantra of Harvey Milk, the gay San Francisco politician assassinated just a few years previously. Gay brothers and sisters, you must come out. The only path to full participation for gay people in society, the only path out of the shame and secrecy of my own adolescence, was through being visible, so that others, our colleagues and classmates, our children and neighbors, our parents and priests, would know we were there. Returning home in 1990, after South Africa's liberation movements were unbanned and Nelson Mandela freed, I wrote publicly about my sexual orientation, and I co-edited a book on gay and lesbian life in South Africa. At the same time, I had a prominent career as a journalist, which was in no way damaged by being out of the closet.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'll let you stop there.
Thank you.
I suppose I have a little bit more questions before I open it up for everyone to ask questions. One is to think about what the role of legal reform plays on the pink line. You spend quite a bit of time in the book speaking about the legal moves that are happening around the world. And I wanted to know, in your own mind, what does legal reform play? Or what role does it play in the pink line?
It's so complicated, Letlhogonolo, as you know and will continue to find out in your own legal career. I think there's a very uneasy dance between legal reform and social change. And we know that better than anywhere in South Africa, where we have, as I just read, among the best rights dispensation in the world, but where we also have this terrible phenomenon of gender-based violence, which affects violence against gender non-conforming queer people. We all know about the corrective rape against butch lesbians. Just last month, there was a tragic and outrageous murder of a brilliant young transgender choreographer named Kieran Fortuyn in his home community on the Cape Flats. So the fact that you have legal reform by no means guarantees social change. But I think that what happens is that that as a result of legal reform, norms can change and space can be claimed. And one of the things I always say about what happens in South Africa now is that so much of the violence we see against queer people on the streets, I don't know if you'll agree, tell me if you agree, let's have a conversation about it, is a consequence, is a backlash against space that has been claimed, which is in itself a consequence of a culture, a human rights culture that comes out of the Constitution. So was there corrective rape in the 1980s and the 1990s, the way there has been in the 2000s? Or is this a phenomenon that's come about because young lesbians have claimed space, have said we are not willing to be on the down low anymore, to get married and have children to men, when in fact we want to live with our women, and in so doing and they've done this in part as a consequence of a post-apartheid human rights culture, and in so doing they have challenged the patriarchy in new ways and in ways that have provoked some backlash from men who feel threatened or emasculated or fearful of this new power. I don't know what you think of that analysis.
I mean, I suppose to begin here, right? I think that there's a number of scholars, including myself, who have pushed against the term corrective rape, right? Because as Sylvia Tamale has written in her formative piece about law, religion, and society, that calling it corrective rape sort of makes it seem as if it's right for the perpetrator to correct a particular thing. So for us as scholars, as queer activists, to move away from calling it corrective rape and rightly call it punitive rape, homophobic rape, hate rape, name the thing for what it is. So I think that just to put that out there. But I think it's also interesting because as I was reading your book, one of the things that I was thinking about is that it appears that the visibility of queer people because of rights coming out creates a visibility that could be positive and could be negative. So on the one hand, you think of the situation of Kenya, for instance, when the Kenyan court had handed down the decision, there seemed to be quite a spur of some form of queer violence that happened post the handing down of the judgment. And that's because of the
judgment that said that sodomy would not be decriminalized.
Yes, and that's the Kenyan society is not ready to allow this to happen, right? So you think about those instances about like how in many ways and I suppose the other question is this, right? When framing your book, there's quite a human rights element that goes to it, right? And thinking about like what human rights has done for queer folks, right? So many of us laud the understanding that, oh my gosh, we finally have rights. And I think particularly in the South African sense, what has happened is when gay marriage happened, it felt like we were stunted. It was like, okay, finally we have rights and now we'll stop. So I wanted to know what your thoughts are about like this, our quest for rights in many ways stopping queer people to exist fully in themselves because now they're more visible, which could mean that they could be a little bit more
No, I share that critique. I think that's a very strong and pertinent analysis. We have to understand the context of marriage equality and where the call for marriage equality comes from, and it is absolutely worth asking about whether marriage equality should be a priority in other parts of the world. Not to say that queers in other parts of the world don't deserve marriage the way American queers deserve marriage, but there are so many issues that affected the people I met more than the law. You know, I've got, let me go back to my kotis in
and I want to
South
speak
India.
a bit about that. I want to speak a bit about that, Mark, because I think that.
So can I give my example
yeah.
from them, because it really speaks exactly to this. So when I first met them in 2012, there was a huge campaign in India about decriminalizing homosexuality, and one of the first things I asked them was, how do they feel about this move to decriminalize Section 377 of the Penal Code? And they sort of looked at me blankly, and they hadn't actually heard of that campaign. And I was kind of like, what? But this is such an important campaign. And Mohana, who is the chief queen of the village, rolled her eyes at me and she said, listen, we know how to deal with the law. We either fuck them or we bribe them. That's really not our issue. Our issue is the family. Give me a solution to get my family to stop marrying me, to let me to live my life and not have to marry a woman because I'm a Koti, I'm a woman myself. Give me that solution and you'll be helping me. And it was really a fascinating object lesson in the limits of law for me.
And I think that's so important, because that's what I wanted to move to when we think about, like you had said, you know, law isn't always the result of social change, right? And to think about the court is talking about the idea that the problem is not the law, the problem is our families. How do we get these people to love us? And we think about that in Michael's story, right, where Michael was shunned from his family and shunned from his community, and just what, and also we think about it in the transgender sections of the book where you speak to parents of trans children, and some of these parents have really strong views about their children's transitioning at a young age. And what are some of the resolves that you've come to thinking about, like how do we bring these rights, you know, that exist in the law in the abstract into the family home?
You know, I don't have a solution. I tell a story in my book that in fact in an interview in News 24, Linda Kuhle and Kosi took some issue with. I hope I've said her name correctly. But I tell a story about two young women in Soweto named Pretty and Spongile. And what happened, and this was in the late 1990s. And what happened is that Pretty's father assaulted Spongile violently, perhaps even with a gun. I can't remember the details. And they landed up in the home, in the office of a newly appointed station commander in Soweto. And this station commander, all of them, the father, it was seen as a family issue. So the father who'd done the assault, Pretty and Spongile, who were the couple, I think Spongile's family too. And the station commander pointed to the portrait of Nelson Mandela. He was the president at the time. And she said, that man, our leader, says it's okay. If it's okay for him and it's okay in our constitution, it must be okay for you. Go home and sort your shit out. And according to Pretty and Spongile, this really changed the dynamics in their family. And the next thing, the assailant started negotiating for bride price. And I tell the story with a somewhat positive spin to say, you know, legal change can affect social change. And in my discussion with Linda Kuhle, she disagreed with me. She said she really doesn't see the story that way because, you know, how appalling that the station commander didn't charge the father for assault, and how terrible that women are sent back into their homes to their assailants because families have to make up. And, you know, I think I'd be interested to hear what you think. I think both Linda Kuhle and I are right. I think that there's a sign of some shift there, but, you know, not enough shift. It was in the late 90s. But I really heard. But I still think that having the law means that as according to a human sciences research council survey that was done a couple of years ago, a majority of South Africans think that homosexuals should have rights. even though a majority of South Africans disapprove of homosexuality. I think that must bring something progressive into our society, and that hopefully the numbers who disapprove will decrease because of an acceptance of a constitutional right.
I mean, I agree somewhat with Linda Kuchler. I remember reading this story and thinking, oh, wow, like there is this communal understanding of go back and sort things out. But honestly, truly, like, what if we can't sort things out because, like, inherently this person is homophobic and they are beating you because they are asserting the hatred towards you and they should be held accountable? But I think that in many ways, I think that what legal reform does is that it sort of makes it not okay for people to be overtly homophobic or transphobic or queerphobic. So in many ways, it sort of shifts something, but I don't think it shifts it completely.
No,
I think one thing that I wanted to ask Mark just before I open it up is this. I sort of took issue with one part of the book. I mean, I think that
only one.
No, there are quite a few, but this one like was really something that was like here. You speak a lot about the trajectory of the trans rights movement in the US, right?
Yeah.
And you speak quite extensively about like the people in support of it and people against it, right? And one of the things that I thought was like, what was the decision for you as an author to write about these parents who were against, young trans children transitioning at an early age? But also secondary to that is the question about why include Caster Semenya in the chapter about transgender rights, right, or the quest of transgender rights, when we know for a fact that Caster Semenya is not transgender. And I wanted to know what was that decision?
Okay. So on the first question, if I was going to define trans rights and early transition as the pink line of American society at the moment, I had to understand how that pink line was being staked from both sides. So I felt it was, even though the people I write about, the people whose stories I tell, the people on whose shoulders I sit, in that chapter are the queer kids themselves, whether they are trans or non-binary or lesbian. I felt that it was very important to understand where the opposition came from to what they were doing and why. And that's my reason for including those voices. As to Caster, I mean, the point I make is that she's not transgender. She's in that chapter because she became used in these new transgender culture wars by both sides. So we accept that she is not transgender. It's clear in my writing that I see her as a woman, and as the cisgender woman she sees herself. But she's used by the anti-trans lobby to say, see, this is what happens if we get rid of gender boundaries, because this is not really a woman. This is a man masquerading as a woman. And because I'm looking at discourse analysis and at the way these arguments play out, it seemed really important to note the way she has become something of a key into the identity politics of our times, into what happens when the way you feel inside is different to the way people see you and judge you and pigeonhole you. And for better or for worse, that's how I explore the Caster story. Not in nearly as much length as I would like to. I would love to write a book about Caster, or read Caster's own book about herself, because she really is a pioneer in so many ways.
Thank you. Let me just ask, there are 2 questions. Please, if you have any questions, please post them on the question box, and then I'll post them to Mark. So the first question, Mark, is how have some of the people in the book responded to the stories after publication?
The responses I've had have been very excited and very positive. I haven't yet had responses from everybody post-publication. I know that the Mexican lesbians who I write about in my Mexico chapter have read the chapters and the chapters about them, and they're very excited and they've shared them widely. A friend of theirs who's a fluent Spanish and English speaker translated them for them. I know that Lakshya, the Koti who I told you about, knows the gist of what the story is about, and that she's been excited about it. Others I've yet to hear from. As you know, I'm not in touch with Liam, so I don't know what Liam thinks, because we're not in touch with each other. I'm hearing as well how that's. It's early days yet. The book's only been published very recently, but none of what's in the book is a surprise to them, because, as I said earlier, they all knew as much as was possible exactly what was in the chapters about them.
The second question is, Mark, is it possible that a post-COVID world will look different? Do you see opportunities for queer activism, or are there new unimagined threats to queer lives?
Oh, that's an absolutely wonderful question, and it's something I'm thinking a lot about. And I'd love to hear what you think too, Letlhogonolo. Kevin mentioned this in his introduction. So being isolated, being sheltered in place in an environment that might be hostile to you is very much part of the queer condition for so many people. Having this, as I said earlier, this kind of online communication that we are having right now in real time, and having to sort of toggle between this and what happens when we close our computers, feeling comfortable in this warm space that Letlhogonolo is holding, and then being aware of the discomfort outside of our rooms, of the people who don't even have enough data to study for matric in this country, and the really shameful cellular companies which are not zero rating websites so that people can get data. Let's not go there. That kind of cognitive dissonance is, I think, part of the queer condition. And I think there's a lot to learn from how that's negotiated. I can't predict what's going to be learned from it beyond just noting those facts. I think that one of the things that queer people have learned from their kind of early adoption of the digital life is the possibilities it holds, the way you can connect, the way you can have this community, the way you can get information, but also the dangers that lurk. So in countries like Egypt, I told you the story of Michael, who was entrapped through Facebook. In Egypt, the Vice Squad actually use Grindr and other hookup apps to entrap homosexual men. There are issues to do with privacy and security that queer people have had to negotiate ever since the digital era began, that we all now have to think of as we live our lives more online. I'm not sure how much that answers the question, but just some thoughts.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think I share some of the sentiments that you've shared. I think in many ways what COVID has taught us as queer people is to forge new ways of being intimate with each other, since we can't be in community with each other. But for many of us, the digital intimacy has been something that has been existing even before COVID, right? We've just had to continue existing as these people who are connected through the internet. But I think also it's, for me personally, and some of the people that I hold community with, I think that it's also teaching us about how to access joys in ways that we are not able to access joy. I feel that many of the conversation that we have as queer people is often about our quest for rights. You know, a lot of the stories that you write about in the book are like disheartening in many ways because of the queer condition in the world, right? But like sometimes we want joy, we want sex, we want love, right? And I think in many ways what the post-COVID world will teach us, for me at least, the move that I'm seeing is people are taking more space to talk openly about queer sex, because, you know, we've sort of thought of it as this deviant thing that people have said it is. But to speak openly about our desires, right? I think often of a trans artist who speaks about the idea of queer dreaming, right? The idea that we can share our nudes with our friends in a loving manner, right? That our intimacy is intimate, even not in a sexual sense. So I think in many ways, we are learning to create our own worlds, right? So to imagine new paths for ourselves, because we know that the world that we currently live in is always going to seek to destroy us, even when we have these rights that we have, right? I think particularly in the South African context, about earlier this year, we've lost 2 trans people, you know, one to illness, but the other one was murdered because just of how like visible we've become and how people don't want us to be visible. So I think in many ways there are unimagined threats to queer lives that are coming because we're becoming more visible. So it's also important for us to, you know, to take care of ourselves. There's another question here. What has most surprised you in writing the book? Are you more or less optimistic about the prospect of queer people around the world?
I mean, I suppose what has surprised me, even though I went looking for it, it surprised me anyway, is resilience. And you know, I mean, as Letlhogonolo said, my stories, the stories I tell, don't necessarily end on a high note, and that's tough. That's tough. I would have really loved to end more stories joyfully, and it's not that there aren't joyful stories out there. And I started following people in 2012. I wasn't kind of betting on who's going to have a happy ending and who isn't. I was just following people because they were interesting and because I felt that they exemplified the pink line dilemma. But even in the stories that I tell, where there's a lot of sadness or loss or difficulty, I'm really struck by the, I've used this word several times in this talk, the agency of the people who I write about, by their determination to be themselves, and even if that means, even if there is great cost at that, and I suppose if I have cause for anything, it's in that resilience and in that agency, because I don't feel like I can say with certainty that the long arc of history is bending towards justice when it comes to people around issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. It feels to me like much more like a pendulum, that rights are claimed and then there's backlash. Space is claimed and then there's backlash. And it's messy and it's complicated. But I feel that what holds us together through it is the sense of resilience and the sense of agency.
There's another question here, Mark. It's from B. Are they right? Mark, I'm looking forward to reading your book. Congrats. I'd like to ask about the use of queer. There are people like Auntie who seemingly are just a woman who happen to be trans. On the African continent, we often speak about queer as colonial in many senses, and for many trans people, not inclusive of trans. I wonder whether the desire to call everyone in this book, especially some of your trans participants, queer, leans towards doing that, and what your thoughts are on this.
Thank you for that question. I mean, as you might imagine, it's something I've thought a lot about. And I make the very strong point that in the book, I label everybody by what they want to be. So I never once call Auntie queer when I'm describing them. And if somebody calls themselves an LGBTI, that's how I describe them. If somebody calls themselves transsexual, I call them transsexual. If somebody calls themselves transgender, I call them transgender. I write at the beginning of the book, and I'm going to read it because rather than say it, because it's really important and I want to get it right. And it's the very, very first thing I write in the book. It's my first note, and it's a note on terminology. I write, I like the word queer because of its double valence. As well as having been reappropriated by people across the world to describe themselves, queer means different or skewed. To see things from a queer perspective is to look at the world askance, to see it afresh. But frankly, it's also convenient. It's a catch-all that can hold, well, most of the L's, the B's, the G's, the T's, and everybody else on the expanding alphabet. For this reason, however, it has sometimes lost its queer meaning, particularly in the United States. If everyone is queer, no one is. I hope to get the balance right here. Also in some parts of the world, including the United Kingdom, African American communities, and my native South Africa, queer remains awkward. This is because it is still so often used as a slur. It's also rejected by some transgender people who are very clear, like Liam, who you will meet in these pages, that they are straight. I've done my best to use the language the people I write about feel most comfortable with. So, maybe I'm trying to square a circle there, and it is convenient to have this phrase queer. But once more, all I can say is that I'm live to the contradictions of it.
There's another question. What do you think about the global Christian right and how it continues to use broadcasting, such as DSTV, to continue to promote hate and pathologizing of queer people?
Yeah, listen, thank you for that question. It's a major theme in the book, and it's another factor. It's another vector of globalization. On one side of the pink line, the homophobes accuse the West of transmitting these signals, these sort of gay signals, to Africa that are going to sort of convert homosexual Africans into homosexuality. But from the very same place, through the Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, I think it's called, messages of homophobia are being transmitted as well from the United States. And really, if you look at the official homophobia in countries like Uganda and Nigeria, or Malawi, the script for this kind of political homophobia comes from the American evangelical right wing. No question about it. Proven by people I cite in my book. That being said, we are all of us who are African, whatever our ethnic background, if we have access to the world in any way, we are hybrid, and we make our own identities, and we download ideas from other parts of the world that suit us, and we reject other parts that don't. And to call homophobia a Western export, I think, is as denying of African agency as to call homosexuality a Western export. There are African homophobes, and there are African homosexuals. So I think that perspective is really necessary. But yes, it's absolutely critical to examine the way a particular script for political homophobia was developed in the United States and brought to other parts of the world once the evangelicals saw that it wasn't having much traction anymore in the United States because of the way that society was changing.
Thank you for that, Mark. Here, I think this may be the final question. Jabu says, really great discussion. I wonder if the pink line forces trans people into the gay agenda, like how the gay agenda destroyed Tuwonge's life in Malawi and here. I'm also wondering if this desire to be legally mainstream, if the subversive culture has been lost.
Yeah, I mean, both two really important points and notions that I try and explore in the book. I mean, I'm not sure, Jabu, whether you're asking whether I am forcing trans people into the gay agenda by writing about the experiences of trans people alongside the experiences of gay people in this book.
Hi, Mark. Are you still here?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I had lost you for a bit.
Okay, I'm not sure where I was lost.
Oh yes, I think you had said that. I think Jabu's question is not necessarily directed at you. I think Jabu's question is about, like, you know, the whole idea of the gay agenda. It's sort of like we think about gay first, we think about anything else. So often posing trans rights in correlation with the gay agenda sort of loses, you know, the transness in itself as a self-standing thing outside of the gay agenda.
Jabu's just actually clarified in a message that he said, the gay agenda to decriminalize. Yes, I do believe that the gay agenda to decriminalize homosexuality says very little to trans people, except where it's used against. Except that, not except when, except that it is used against trans people. So look at how in Malawi, Jabu, the sodomy law was used against a transgender woman. And therefore, I think there's some grounds for decriminalizing homosexuality in Malawi so that that particular law can't be used against people like Tiwonge too. I can give another example very quickly from Russia. My Russian story is about a transgender woman, I hope you read it, named Pasha, who lost custody of her child. Now, why did she lose custody of her child? She lost custody of her child because there's a law in Russia that's an anti-gay propaganda law that says it is a crime to promote homosexuality to minors. And the other parent of the child, after Pasha transitioned, went to court and said, Pasha is promoting homosexuality to our child just by virtue of being transgender. And even though we might accept that transgender and gay and transgenderism and homosexuality are different things, the court viewed Pasha as an avatar of homosexuality and was able to do so because of anti-gay legislation in Russia. So Pasha is a trans woman who is a victim of anti-homosexual legislation, just as Tiwonge is. That being said, I couldn't agree with you more that an overwhelming obsession with the decriminalization of homosexuality doesn't begin to understand the ways that transgender people are criminalized. So, for example, in all the former British colonial states, there's the anti-sodomy law, but there's also an anti-vagabondage law, which makes it illegal if you are quote unquote male-bodied to dress as a woman in public. And it's that law that's used against trans people. And there's much less talk about reforming that law in the Caribbean and in Africa, in Nigeria, than there is about reforming the anti-gay laws. So in that respect, I really agree with you, Babu.
Mark, there's two more questions. One is, I just need to go to it. What do you hope to achieve with this book?
You know, I would love readers of this book to understand, even if they are part of our community of so-called progressive people, to understand more about these dynamics and how they work. And I want to provoke discussions and debates, such as the one we've had here, from which I learned too. I want to expand our minds, all of our minds, including my own.
And another question is, I wonder whether Mark has ever, I don't know what happened. Okay, there we go.
I'm still here.
I wonder whether Mark, I don't know, let me do this. Can it see?
I can hear you.
Okay. The question is, I wonder whether Mark has ever considered delivering these stories in multimedia format. As we know, on the continent, the African continent especially, print does not travel as well as broadcast, and these stories undoubtedly deserve to be told and seen widely.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I agree with you more, and I'm really obsessed with or very preoccupied with that very issue. I was really glad to hear tonight that that some of this work is going to be part of the Pride Afrique that's happening next weekend, which is this amazing online African continental initiative. I am really open to collaborating with people who have ideas about working with sound and with video rather than just with words. I should say too that this very discussion is now what we might call a digital asset that's going to be available online from the moment we log off, and I hope it's distributed widely.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think a final question before we wrap up is to think about, I left the book thinking about the transient nature of the people that you wrote about. And the question that I kept asking myself is this question of citizenship, right? So a number of people leave their home countries to seek asylum in, let's think of South Africa, Vancouver, and Amsterdam. And I'm wondering about, like, what are your thoughts are about, like, the transient nature of people who, may have a gender identity that people don't like, or a sexual orientation that is not accepted in society. What are some of your thoughts about, like, this claim to citizenship that, this claim to citizenship?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking as well about the many meanings of the word transition, and how we speak now in sort of common parlance of transitioning from one place to another or one state to another, using language that was actually given to us by trans people. I think that for queer people, as for everybody, there's a dance. Theresa May said famously during the Brexit debate, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And that for me defines the kind of narrow, cramped, populist nationalism of our times, of which queer people are victims. Whether it's trans people in Trump's America, or trans people in Viktor Orban's Hungary, or all LGBTQ people in Brazil, where Jair Bolsonaro uses this discourse too. And I mean, I suppose I like to think of how not just because I travel, because I have had the extraordinary privilege of having traveled, even though it's a whole new world now with the pandemic, but also because of these identities I have that are global, that rather than being a citizen of everywhere and a citizen of nowhere, I'm a citizen of everywhere and a citizen of South Africa. And I don't know how much that answers your question, Letlhogonolo. For me personally, my South African citizenship is inviolate, but that's because no one's tried to take it away from me. I want to actually ask Auntie when I next see her, and I see her quite often, whether she still thinks of herself as Malawian, given what the Malawian state did to her. I know that Maha and Amira, the Egyptian women who now live in the Netherlands, still very much see themselves as Egyptian. And they are enraged that the Egyptian state is denying them their rights as Egyptians. I don't know if that riff even begins to answer your question.
Yeah, and I think, for people who are listening, just to sit with the notion of citizenship, right? I think that the Pink Line in many ways forces us to confront the idea of like the privilege of citizenship, but also the disadvantage of wanting to participate in citizenship, right? Because for Auntie's instance, right, her claiming a Malawian identity means denouncing her identity as a woman, right? So to think about like how those two exist next to each other and those tensions, right? But thank you for everyone who's tuned into this discussion. Again, thank you, Mark, for this conversation. I thought it was really fruitful. Please don't forget to buy the Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. It's available at Love Books and all other bookstores, but Love Books, you will get a signed copy. So please support independent bookstores during this time. So if you're in Cape Town, just go over to the Book Lounge or Clark Bookstore in order to get the book. And if you're in Johannesburg, you can also pop over to Love Books in order to get the book.
Can I say one thing in conclusion? As we're talking, I'm reading the really amazing chat box down the side, and I noticed that people are sharing links for campaigns like the Fruit Basket GoFundMe campaign. And somebody wrote, we need to all do what we can. And I'm going to say something not because I want to virtue signal, but because it's part of my commitment. I've decided that all royalties I earn off this book in South Africa in 2020, the equivalent are going to COVID relief programs that benefit LGBTQ refugees in South Africa. And I've decided to do that because of the way they fall through the net. They don't get the social security that South Africans get. Many of them work in ways that they don't have formal employment because they don't have papers that allow them to have formal employment. And they can't, I think this is really important, fall back on their, if you like, ethnic or national communities because of the way they're ostracized because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. So whereas a cisgender Malawian or a straight Malawian might be supported by Malawians with resources in these tough times, for someone like Auntie, it's really fraught because of the way she is othered and victimized within that very community because of her gender identity.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. That's even more reason for us to go and buy the book because we know the royalties will go to people who need relief during this time because of where we are and how difficult it has been. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. The conversation will still be available for recording and we'll share it on various social media platforms if you want to return to it. And also, again, just to follow our Cheeky Natives, to have some more great discussions about books. We're committed to really having critical engagements and critical discussions about books written particularly by Black people in South Africa and across the globe. So thank you once again to Jonathan Ball for allowing us to have this conversation, to Love Books for hosting us, and thank you, Mark, for being in conversation with us. And thank you, everyone, for spending this Thursday evening to be in community with us. Until next time, be safe and stay at home.